Chapter 2 of our text deals with culture and interpersonal communication. The chapter is divided up into culture and communication first, second, cultural values and norms, third, co-cultures and communication, fourth, codes and culture, and then fifth, developing intercultural communication competence. The USA is becoming increasingly a very diverse and multicultural and multi-ethnic society, especially so in the last 30 years or so. Let's define culture first. Culture is defined as the language, beliefs, traditions, and customs people share and learn. This definition shows that culture is to a great extent a matter of perception and definition, and so let's unpack that and see what that means. When you identify yourself as a member of a culture, you recognize yourself and others as sharing certain characteristics. And then second, you see those who don't possess those characteristics as members of another category, of different categories. We refer to these as in-groups and out-groups. In-groups describe those with whom we identify, and out-groups describe those whom we view, in our perception, as different. So your participation and membership in a culture, in a context, contributes to your social identity, that part of the self-concept that is based on membership in groups. Co-culture, on the other hand, describes the perception of membership in a group that is part of a larger culture. So co-cultures may be described in terms of categories such as the following: age, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, nationality, geographic region, in terms of a physical disability, religion, and the activities that you enjoy, whether you're a gamer, you're a biker, so a hobby or interest that you engage in. When you are part of this co-culture, very often unique patterns of communication and connection come into being. Think of gamers who have a certain jargon, a certain language, and those who are not gamers really don't understand that jargon or the language itself. So the connection experienced by members of this co-culture, can create challenges when communicating with those outside the group. If you think of the USA may be divided into three macro co-cultures, if we can say this in a very broad sense. One is New England and the Mid-Atlantic states, where they are described as temperamental and uninhibited. Second is the South and Midwest, where they are described as friendly and very conventional. And then the West Coast, the Rocky Mountains, and the Sun Belt is described as relaxed and creative. So when you're part of a co-culture, it can be a significant source of enrichment and pride. But at the same time, there are often tensions between identifying with one group and then trying to fit into the larger culture. Very often this falls along racial and ethnic lines. African American students, for example, reveal that they struggle to fit into a predominantly white university. They're proud of their cultural heritage, but also trying to adapt to a historically white university. Members of some co-cultural groups can face exclusion and discrimination because of this identity. And then in other cases, co-cultures voluntarily embrace the chance to distinguish themselves from society at large. So they highlight themselves and they want to be seen as different. Intercultural communication is the process that occurs when members of two or more cultures or co-cultures exchange messages in such a way that is influenced by their different cultural perceptions, both verbal and nonverbal. We all belong to many groups. And since we belong to many groups, it might appear that all communication is in some sense affected by culture. That is true to some degree, but in some sense, not all communication is affected by culture. Even in an increasingly diverse world, there are still plenty of relationships in which people share a basic common background or framework. Even though they may vary ethnically or racially, they still share a significant amount of overlap that the communication might not be intercultural communication. Second, even when people with different cultural backgrounds communicate, those differences may not be salient. They may not be important. So rather than classifying some exchanges as intercultural and others as free from cultural influences, it's more correct to talk about degrees of cultural significance. So the encounter between two individuals could fit along a spectrum or continuum of interculturalness. At the most intercultural end are situations in which communicators have highly different backgrounds or beliefs. A traveler, for example, visiting a new country for the first time with little knowledge of the beliefs, attitudes, and values or norms of the country. At the least intercultural end of the spectrum fall exchanges in which cultural differences are not significant. So note that intercultural communication doesn't always occur when people from different cultures interact. It only occurs when the cultural backgrounds, the perceptions, and the symbol systems, meaning verbal and non-verbal ways of communicating, must have a significant impact on the exchange before we can say that culture has made a difference. So what is salient in the group that highlights itself, that highlights the difference between the two individuals, so much so that intercultural communication occurs? For example, the text used to this one: members of a school basketball team, some Asian, some Black, some Latino, and some white, very often are intent on winning the league championship. And during the game, very few cultural distinctions. They're not salient. Let's put it that way. There's plenty of communication, but it's fundamentally not intercultural. Away from the game, however, they might notice some fundamental differences in the way members of each group communicates. Let's get now to interpersonal and intercultural dimensions of communication. We have a model, and this model shows that some interpersonal transactions have virtually no intercultural elements. For example, a conversation between two siblings who have been raised in the same household. On the other hand, other encounters are almost exclusively intercultural, but without the personal dimensions. For example, a traveler from Senegal trying to get directions from a Ukrainian taxi driver in New York City. Very intercultural in some sense, but not very interpersonal. They're not trying to develop a relationship at all, even though communication is different because of their different backgrounds and way of communicating. So as you look at this diagram, figure 2.2, you see on the axes, on the one axis is interpersonal significance, and on the other axis is intercultural significance. Examine it and study it so you can see the difference between the two. Intercultural differences as generalizations. It's important to remember that cultural practices aren't totally different. People from varied backgrounds often share enough common ground to make relationships work. Moreover, there are sometimes greater differences within cultures than between them. Let's move now to the next section that deals with cultural values and norms. Some cultural influences on communication are obvious, but some on the other hand are far less visible. There are 5 basic factors that that affect our communication, and we'll get into this in the next video segment.